A big-name wide receiver potentially becomes available, and the Jets may not be the most likely destination for him, but they should be very aggressive in trying to land him. All this and more today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, March 6th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangrenNation.com. Thanking you so much for making the show your first listener, first watch every day. And a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. On today's show, we're going to do a bonus mailbag. Usually we do our mailbag shows on Wednesday. We did one yesterday, but there were a couple leftover questions I wanted to get to. And since we're heading near the start of free agency, there's going to be a lot of breaking news, so we may miss a couple mailbags along the way. So I wanted to answer as many of these questions as I can because I really enjoy the interaction with the listeners. So our first question is about some of the big news in the NFL on Wednesday. John, sounds like DK Metcalf could be on the trade block from the Seattle Seahawks. How interested should the Jets be? And I think the answer to that is very interested. Now, the report came out on Wednesday that DK Metcalf has requested a trade from the Seattle Seahawks, which is one thing, and that's news. But perhaps news that's just as important is that the Seahawks sound like they're going to, at least explore the option of trading him. Now, there's no guarantee he actually will be dealt, but Metcalf is entering the final year of his contract. So it sounds like Metcalf at least is theoretically available. And I think the Jets should be very interested. This fits exactly the profile of the type of player I think the Jets should try and go after. First of all, I talked about this a little bit yesterday on the show. He's a playmaker. And I was asked a question, which wide receiver should the Jets be interested in? And the reality was it was difficult to answer that question because at the time I was recording Metcalf, the news about Metcalf's trade request had not gone through. And, the options of free agency were kind of underwhelming. If you get past Ted McMillan out of Arizona, it's not really clear you can find a plug-and-play type draft pick. So I didn't really have a great answer. We kind of wish DK Metcalf had made that trade request a little bit earlier before I recorded the podcast because I think he'd be a great fit. For the Jets this offseason, I think there's this misnomer that the Jets are focused solely on the future right now. The reality is the Jets are going to try and win next year, but they're going to kind of take a more balanced approach than we've seen the last couple of years. They're going to try and win, but it's not going to be at the expense of the future. 2023, 2024, Jets have tried to win. The future just did not matter to this team. This team did not take a balanced approach. Jets are now going to look for guys who can help them now and help them later. And I think DK Metcalf's the type of guy who can do both. He fits the age profile I'm looking for. He's 27. He's not going to turn 28 he'll turn 28 in the season, but not till late in the season. And, he's a proven commodity. Every single year he's been in the NFL, he's produced at least 900 yards, and he's had 3,000-yard seasons. This year, he missed 2 games and still fell 8 yards short of 1,000 yards. So this is a guy who's been frequently very productive, a guy who's been very consistent through his career. And I think he adds a lot of the attributes Garrett Wilson doesn't have. I think I'm a bit of a skeptic on the idea that receivers have to complement each other because sometimes if you have 2 good receivers who do the same thing, you can overwhelm a defense in that way. But I like the idea of DK Metcalf and Garrett Wilson working together. And, I really think you got to load up at try and figure out a way to load up at the wide receiver position this offseason. If you're the Jets, from the standpoint that the quarterback situation probably going to be a little dicey, or at least it's going to be unclear. And you got a receiving group of DK Metcalf and Garrett Wilson. I think a lot of quarterbacks are going to look good with that, especially when you got Breece Hall as a receiving option out of the backfield, and you got Breece's home run ability as a rusher. That's a situation when you have an offensive line that's at least a solid pass blocking unit. That's a situation that's potentially conducive to an offense that can produce and an offense that can lift a quarterback up. We'd love to find a guy who can be, the quarterback, the Lamar Jackson, the Joe Burrow, the Patrick Mahomes type who can lift the offense up. And the Jets will undoubtedly seek that quarterback, but I'm not sure they're going to be able to land that guy this offseason. The guys who will be available this offseason are essentially guys who are going to be as good as their circumstances. If you put them in a good situation, they're going to have success. You put them in a bad situation, they'll fail, but you put them in a good situation, they can have success. If you add DK Metcalf to this roster, you're in a situation where you can have success. Now, I know one question mark will be Metcalf's contract situation because he is entering the final year of his deal. And I know some people may say, well, the Jets have to pay Garrett Wilson soon. They can't afford to pay DK Metcalf and Garrett Wilson. I would question that statement. Now, the Jets would undoubtedly, if they kept Wilson and got Metcalf, they undoubtedly would have one of the most expensive receiver rooms in the league. But I don't think that that's necessarily a bad thing because it would be worth it. It's one thing to have it's one thing to overpay guys, but if you have the best receiver room in the league because you have a great 1-2 punch, that's not a bad thing. And you can afford to have weaknesses in other areas if you can overwhelm the other team with strength at the receiver position. You would have to perhaps cut back your spending in other positions. But what you're getting out of the receiver position is so good that you would not necessarily need to be as good at other spots on the field. What's DK Metcalf seeking? Now, that's the big question because, if he's seeking, what the kind of the money the Jets did not want to pay Davante Adams, $38 million, that might be a tough sell. But if he's looking for just, regular number one receiver money, then I think he's a very interesting proposition. Josina Anderson of ESPN, who's, been the real MVP of the Jets this offseason. I think she has ties to Aaron Glenn because she's been on top of every story before any story published. This was not a Jets specific scoop, but she indicated that at least one team interested to giving DK Metcalf a 3rd round pick. And look, if Metcalf's contract demands are not outrageous, I don't think that's an outrage. I don't think that's a crazy ask, especially the Jets' 3rd round pick. They don't have their own 3rd round pick. It's going to the Raiders for Davante Adams, but they do have a 3rd round pick, a late 3rd round pick that they got from Detroit. It was part of a draft day trade they made last year where they gave up a 4 for a future 3. It was a very savvy move by Joe Douglas. Jets ended up with an earlier pick this year than the pick they gave up last year. I'd be open to giving up that pick. And through the years, I've kind of evolved on my idea of trading picks for established players. Now, I don't think you can be reckless. I think in many ways the Jets have been reckless the last couple of years. I think the Rodgers trade they overpaid. I think the Hassan Reddick trade they overpaid. I think the Davante Adams trade they overpaid. You don't want to give up like early picks for guys who are going to be around for just a year or two, but if you can get an established high-end player who is going to be on the team for a number of seasons going forward, I think that's a very acceptable way to part with a pick. The issue with Rodgers was, you didn't know how long he was going to be, but you knew you probably were not getting more than 2 years. And the Jets, for all intents and purposes, got 1. Technically, they got 2, but for all intents and purposes, they got 1. For Reddick, you knew they were giving up a 3rd round pick for a 1-year rental. For Adams, you knew they were giving up a 3rd round pick for was probably a 3/4 of a year rental. You can get DK Metcalf at 27 years old, and there's a good chance he can be in with your team for a number of years going forward. That's an acceptable way to give. That's an acceptable package to give up, a 3rd round pick for something like that. I think that your draft pick. I think that you build in the NFL primarily through the draft, but the great players don't make it to free agency. The top end players don't. So they either get extended by their current team, or they get traded because the current team wants to get something in return for a top-end player. And I think if you can get a top-end player, and I don't want to overstate Metcalf, he's not an all-pro, he's not a top 5 receiver, but he's a very good receiver. You put him and Garrett Wilson, pair them together, they're a very good 1-2 punch. Now, look, there's going to be some pretty intense competition for DK Metcalf, and Metcalf apparently wants to go to a winning team, which the Jets are not right now. But look, this is a guy, he's much better than the other options out there. Perfect age, good skill set to pair with Garrett Wilson. Jets need to at least explore this, I think. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about an early progress report for the new regime, Aaron Glenn and Darren Mougey. Now, difficult to really draw too many sweeping conclusions because they haven't really added players yet. They haven't, won or lost any games. But I do think there are a couple things we can say about them so far. I'll give you an early progress report on the new Jets leadership as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Chewy. You've probably heard of Chewy. They really do have everything you need to keep your pet healthy and happy. Whether you're shopping for food, treats, or even pet healthcare, Chewy makes it fast, easy, and affordable. With over 100,000 products from all your favorite brands, Chewy has everything your pet needs, from foods to treats to toys, beds, and grooming. It's not just for dogs and cats. They've got supplies for birds, fish, reptiles, and small pets too. Chewy also makes it easy to manage your pet's health with prescriptions, telehealth visits with your vet, and even in-person vet clinics rolling out nationwide. AutoShip is a game changer. You can set automatic deliveries for food, treats, or any essentials so you never run out. You can easily change or cancel it at any time. And Chewy has everything you need to keep your pet healthy and happy. Right now, you can save $20 on your first order and get free shipping by going to chewy.com or clicking the link in the description. Save $20 off your first order with free shipping by clicking the link in the description. Minimum purchase required, new customers only. Terms and conditions apply. See site for complete details. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day, and a big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Doing a little bonus mailbag today. Lots of good listener questions this week. Our next question, John, do you have any early impressions on Aaron Glenn and Darren Mougey? Is it too early to say anything about their work so far with the Jets? I think it's too early to say most things. Look, we, as I mentioned, heading into the break, they haven't really done anything yet. They haven't had their first offseason yet, and even after they have their first offseason, they haven't won or lost any games. The Jets have not played a single game under the Aaron Glenn, Darren Mougey leadership tandem. I think at this point in time, like 90% of fans are like optimistic it's going to work out because these guys haven't shown any flaws yet. That's one of the things about hiring a first-time GM and first-time head coach. There's no track record of failure, so they can be anything you want them to be. What I would say so far, and look, very early days, and I will tell you that, if the Jets get into free agency and don't make moves that I think are so good, I'll be the first one to tell you that, be the first one to change it. But I do get the sense for the first time in years, there is a sense of professionalism emanating from the people running the Jets. I liked the way they handled the Aaron Rodgers decision. I liked it from the standpoint that they did not drag it out. And you've seen it. You saw it 2 years ago. You saw it when Rodgers was in Green Bay. The drama that can be created from will Aaron Rodgers play with us next year? Won't he? It can be the talk of the NFL. I like the fact they made a quick decision. And I also like the fact that I think that, in my opinion, they made the right decision. That Rodgers, while he is obviously an immortal player in this league, there's no question he'll be a first ballot Hall of Famer. I'd say unanimous, but that's not like the way the Hall of Fame operates. But if it operated like baseball, he'd be a unanimous choice probably, or maybe not because the way baseball writers make weird votes. But he should be there's no question he's a Hall of Famer. There's no question he's one of the greatest quarterbacks who's ever lived. But he was at best an average quarterback last year, and his stock is trending down. He's been in decline. His numbers have been declining for 4 years at this point. And I think it's unlikely he's going to turn it around at age 41, age 42. And, I think that it's more likely he's going to decline, and you just don't need to pay $37.5 million, which was what Rodgers was going to make to get that caliber of quarterback play. That's not to mention, do you have to bring back Devontae Adams at that point? Do you have to bring back Allen Lazard? Not to mention the other side stuff that comes with Rodgers, the stuff that could be distractions. I have a tough time finding it a plausible case for being a good idea for the Jets to bring Rodgers back. But in the past, I don't think the Jets have really been focused about football, especially these last 2 years. It's really felt to me like the Jets have been more focused on winning the offseason, on getting the praise from the people on cable, from the people from talk radio, all the content creators. The Jets have essentially been the chiefs of the offseason the last couple of years. They dominate the offseason discussion because they make splashy moves, but these moves aren't always good moves. What they gave up for Rodgers, the idea that Rodgers was the only option for them, the idea that just simply adding Rodgers and was enough to make them a contender, to the point where you're giving Allen Lazard a big contract to make Rodgers happy, to the point where you're signing Randall Cobb, who can't play anymore, to make Rodgers happy, to the point where Nathaniel Hackett gets a job and then keeps a job to keep Rodgers happy, that Rodgers could overcome this. That was not accurate. Happened in smaller moves too, bringing in the flashy Hassan Reddick and sending out the more meat and potatoes type John Franklin Myers because it's a splashy move. That's John Franklin Myers is a good player. He's not as big of a name as Hassan Reddick, but he was a better fit for the Jets. Those are the types of moves the Jets have made. And if the Jets were interested in winning the offseason again, well, the move was to bring Rodgers back, because Rodgers, you could cherry pick stats. You could cherry pick the handful of stats that make him look good. You could pretend he was more effective than he really was. You could start playing into the narrative. Well, the coaching is going to be better this year. You could start playing into the narrative. Well, he's a year removed from the Achilles injury, even though he's 41, and the Achilles injuries for players his age, is a real danger thing. You could start, well, the Jets, it's going to be so different this year. Devontae Adams will be there in training. You could spin the narrative. And it's a very easy thing to do. That's the way you win the offseason. The way you build a good team is through things that are far less splashy. It's, stockpiling draft picks. It's acquiring players in their prime from other teams. It's not about adding guys in their 30s. Not about adding the Tyrod. I mean, occasionally, if you have one hole, you can add like a guy like Tyron Smith if you have a hole at left tackle. But it's not about having holes through your roster that you're just adding these big names at their end of their career when they're past their prime. It's about managing your cap well. It's about things that just don't get you the praise, but they win you games. Look at the great teams in this league. How many times are they the team that's declared the offseason winner? It happens occasionally, but not all that often. Jets have been too often just focused on optics. They've been focused on narrative, and it's been, in my opinion, to their detriment. So I think that we've seen a real sense of leadership from this group that maybe hasn't been there in the recent past. And it's very early. The important work is still to come. They've done none of the important work yet. And if they don't do this important work, none of what I said just mattered. We're very early. We're just getting first impressions to the point where something like what I mentioned, which for a regime 3-4 years in would mean nothing. That's all we have to go on right now. But I've liked what I've seen at this early point. There's still a long way to go now. Our next question, John, I keep hearing you say that the Jets are not tanking this year, but help me to explain this. They don't have a quarterback. Wouldn't they be better off trying to get a better draft pick? Well, I think first of all, they've just too much underlying talent on the roster. I mentioned this yesterday. Look, for all of Joe Douglas's issues, and I think there were many. I think he managed the cap horribly. He just wasn't as good as he was cracked up to be. He was supposed to be the next Ozzie Newsome. He was a guy who wasn't that great. For all his issues, he did add some quality young pieces that this team can now build around going forward. And these quality young pieces, unless there's team-wide injuries, probably going to prevent them from being the worst team in the league. But I don't agree with the premise that the best spot to be in the NFL is either, there's an old saying in the NBA, you either want to be really good or really bad, because if you're really good, you can compete for a championship. If you're really bad, you can get a franchise-changing draft pick. Now, even in the NBA, I think it's questionable how accurate that is, because I don't think tanking necessarily wins you as much in the NBA as people think. And I think being in the middle of the NBA sometimes leaves you closer than people think. But the NFL is certainly not true. In the NFL, you have a team of 53 players. You're much better off being kind of in the middle, because then all you have to do is supplement supplement the good parts on your roster. Whereas if you just tear it down and you're awful, you have a really long way to build. And to the extent teams have actually gone all out to tank, or at least something resembling tanking, I mean, it was the Cleveland Browns in 2016, 2017. It really hasn't gone that well for them. I think they've won one playoff game since that endeavor. Miami Dolphins. Miami Dolphins did that in 2019. It really, these teams have been better. They've made the playoffs a couple times, but they haven't built their teams into a superpower. So I think the Jets, would you rather be where the Jets were in 2021 than where they are right now? Now you've got Sauce, and you got Garrett, and you got Brees, and you got AVT, and you got Tippmann, and you got Carter. Would you really rather be where the Jets were? Do you think the Jets were in better shape in 2021 than they are today? Look, say what you will about Joe Douglas, and I've said a lot about him. I do think he left the team in a better position than he found it. Now, there were lots of issues with Joe Douglas. I don't think he was the GM that could build the Jets to a championship team, but the Jets are in a better position than they would be if they were just in complete teardown mode. And I don't think trading off your great players for picks is really the way you get back. I'm a big believer in adding picks, but not at the expense of giving away your great players. I don't think that's a recipe for success. That here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll turn our attention to Tyrod Taylor. Was this a case of the Jets investing in the quarterback position, the backup quarterback spot, as I've frequently been advocating? I'm not so sure about that. I'll go into more detail on that as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. On this Thursday, we're doing a bonus mailbag episode. Our next question, John, I questioned at the time why you criticized the Jets for signing Tyrod Taylor to a 2-year contract, as you were always talking about the importance of the backup quarterback. In retrospect, are you happy with their decision at this point in time? Okay, fair critique. I understand where you're coming from because, yes, I do frequently say that I do think teams underinvest at the backup quarterback spot. I think a perfect example of that was the Jets in 2023 when they did not bring in a credible backup for Aaron Rodgers. And to be honest with you, if the Jets had done that in 2023, I don't know if the season would have gone all that much better because, like, you lose your quarterback week 1, the first series of the year, you're going to be a tough spot. And I think that there were other parts of the team that were not built up properly. So I understand your critique. So let me try and explain to you where I was coming from, because when I criticized the Jets for giving Tyrod Taylor a second year, I was saying that fully acknowledging, I do think teams for the most part underinvest in the backup quarterback role. This my issue with Tyrod Taylor, what the Jets did with Tyrod Taylor was, I did not think that they needed to give him a second year guaranteed. And it wasn't that and maybe I've misspoken a little bit. It's not that they gave him a 2-year contract, because a 2-year contract doesn't mean anything if there are no guarantees for the second year. If you give a player a 2-year contract, but only the first year is guaranteed, it's really just an option year for the second year. It's meaningless. Tyrod Taylor's actually had a couple of those contracts. He had a 2-year contract with the Chargers. If you go back, he had a 2-year contract with the Giants the year before he came to the Jets. It wasn't so much the second year. It's the fact that they gave him so many guarantees that essentially some of them bled into the second year, and it got to the point where it virtually guaranteed he'd be on the roster in year 2. Because I don't think that Tyrod Taylor was such a hot commodity that was required. He was leaving the Giants. He hasn't been the starting quarterback since the year 2017. And, if a team was not investing enough at the wide receiver position, and they gave Alan Lazard, $11 million a year, would you say, well, you can't criticize them because, they're investing at the receiver position? I mean, I don't think so. I think Tyrod Taylor was fine for what the 2024 Jets needed. What the 2024 Jets were really looking for was a guy who could run an offense credibly if Aaron Rodgers suffered like a short-term injury, if Aaron Rodgers missed a week or 2 weeks, 3 weeks. Then you wanted somebody who was good enough that he could keep the offense afloat. And I think it was critical for the Jets to get a veteran quarterback. It is not because Zach Wilson was a young quarterback who failed in 2023. It was because of who the Jets were bringing back at offensive coordinator. We have talked a lot about the decision to bring Nathaniel Hackett back in 2024. We can go back to the decision to hire Nathaniel Hackett. In the moment, it was a really bad decision. I mean, you can go back to what Jets fans were saying at the moment they hired Nathaniel Hackett. It was a very, very suspect decision. But in 2023, when Aaron Rodgers went down, Nathaniel Hackett did nothing to adjust the offense. And, with Aaron Rodgers as quarterback, Rodgers is running the entire show at the line of scrimmage. I mean, he's changing plays, he's changing routes, he's scanning the defense. He's figuring out a hole in the defense. I mean, look, Aaron Rodgers physically isn't what he used to be, but mentally he's really sharp. He's probably the smartest quarterback in the league. He's been doing it for 20 years. He can figure out anything at the line of scrimmage. Zach Wilson can't. So Aaron Rodgers wants a static offense. And Peyton Manning was like this too. I remember seeing a report that the Jets essentially gave Rodgers 3 plays to pick from, and he scanned the defense at the line of scrimmage and decided which play they were going to run. And that's what Peyton Manning did for his career, because Peyton Manning, he was the general at the line of scrimmage. He decided everything. Rodgers is kind of the same way. And Rodgers usually liked a static offense. Rodgers did not like a lot of motion. Rodgers liked to determine who went in motion, because Rodgers may see something at the line of scrimmage, and he's not quite sure. But if he puts this guy in motion, the defense will have to tip its hand. So Rodgers liked controlling this stuff. A younger quarterback like Zach Wilson, he needs more help. He needs a motion built into the play, because a motion built into the play could tip something off to the defense that he's not seeing. But he's not going to know everything. So you send a guy in motion before the play by design, he may be able to pick something up that he wouldn't have been able to see otherwise. He's not going to go in with a detailed knowledge of what the defense is doing. He's kind of just trying to figure it out. He's trying to piece it together. If you help him out like that, he'll figure it out. He'll maybe get from 50% of understanding to 60% of understanding. He's not the guy who's going to run the entire show at the line of scrimmage. Well, Nathaniel Hackett did nothing to help Zach Wilson out. So if you're going to bring back Nathaniel Hackett, you need a veteran quarterback like a Tyrod Taylor, a guy who knows how to set the protection, a guy who knows how to make the changes at the line of scrimmage. Tyrod doesn't do it as well as Rodgers, but he's going to do it a lot better than a younger quarterback. So the Jets needed to get a veteran guy in here in Tyrod Taylor. But Tyrod Taylor hasn't started since 2017. And if I was going to be okay with the Jets giving a quarterback a guaranteed second year, well, I wanted to be a guy who I felt comfortable as the starting quarterback heading into 2025 if Rodgers retired. And look, they weren't going to get somebody who was going to be a spectacular option, but somebody who could provide stability, somebody you could buy into. And look, I respect Tyrod Taylor's career. If you look at him, a day 3 pick out of Virginia Tech, who sat for years in Baltimore, went to Buffalo, had a couple credible seasons as a starting quarterback, has gone on to a long career as a backup. Team always a team willing to give him a job. Lots of respect for him during his career, but that's different from me saying that I'd be comfortable with the Jets starting him at quarterback in 2025. I simply would not. I mean, look, as bad as the options are, I don't really think Tyrod should be an option because, again, he hasn't been a full-time starter in 8 years. Even when he was a full-time starter 8 years ago, he was solid, but he was unspectacular. And you'd have to assume, in his mid-30s, there's probably been some decline, especially for a guy who relied so heavily on his mobility in his prime. So I do think teams undervalue the backup quarterback spot. I don't think it's necessarily mutually exclusive with the idea the Jets gave Tyrod Taylor too much money. And the big reason I criticized the Jets was I felt like it was about optics. I don't think the Jets. I think the Jets overpaid Tyrod Taylor, but I don't think the Jets overpaid Tyrod Taylor because they thought he was that valuable. I think the Jets wanted to make a big show out of the idea. Look, we're taking the backup quarterback spot seriously, because it goes back to something I said earlier. With the Jets, it hasn't always been about football in the last couple of years. And I'm cautiously optimistic that's changing based on the first couple of weeks of Glenn and Mougey. It's been about optics. They do things so that they'll get media praise, because after what happened with Zach Wilson in 2023, everybody in the media said, "Oh, they got to invest in the backup quarterback spot." Well, that doesn't make it a good. Okay, I think you should invest, but just throwing a lot of money at anybody, that doesn't make it a worthwhile investment. And I don't, with all due respect to Tyrod Taylor, who I think has had a good career, I don't think that was a worthwhile investment for the Jets. So I hope that that explains the discrepancy that you may see when I say teams should invest more in the backup quarterback spot, but yet I come back and maybe question the Jets giving Tyrod Taylor that money. That's kind of where my head is at. So, hopefully that, you may not agree, but I hope you can at least see where I'm coming from now on that. And thank you for that question, because I do think you raised a fair point. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. If you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Have a great Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.